Well, we're Phil and Ellen Baer, and we are your forest readers for today. And we are going to be reading two apiece, some of our essays from our collections, which are in the library if you wanted to pick them up and read more of them. I'm going to read two essays today that are centered on my father. And the first one is called Keeping Things in Perspective. In the foreground of the painting, "My father was as big as a tree," is the father, a big-handed, shambling barrel of a man standing at ease in a worn black suit. His son, a jug-eared, squinting boy about 6 years old, sits below and behind him, tiny as he looks up from a homemade soapbox derby racer. Beside the son, behind the father, is the tree that serves as the boy's measuring stick. Its trunk juts out of yellow-brown Mississippi Delta clay, broader than the father's thigh but narrower than his waist. Its crown of sparse leaflets spans the width of the painting, arching over and reaching a point just the tiniest bit above the father's fedora. The boy's father, big as a tree. The painting is by Carol Clore, a primitive surrealist who depicted his childhood memories of people, family, and places. In this piece, he illustrates the role of perspective, pointing out how age and place determine the point of view that in turn determines how a child will remember what he or she sees. My earliest encounter with the concept was a Reader's Digest piece that I read as a youngster. It was written by the father of two boys, ages 4 and 6. He had taken the boys back to the little place in the country where he had lived until he was the age of his older son. It was their first visit and the first time he had gone back. The thing the boys were most excited about was that they would get to go to their father's childhood swimming hole, which he had described to them so vividly and so often. They would see the swift-flowing creek, really almost a river, the swimming hole so wide and deep that only big boys could swim all the way across or dive down and reach the bottom, and the rope swing tied to a branch so high up that swinging out over the water and letting go was a rite of passage. They reached the farm in mid-afternoon, the boys bouncing with barely contained energy and anticipation. They started out walking with their father, but when they reached the path to the swimming hole, the boys raced ahead, quickly out of his sight. He walked on until around a bend he came to the water's edge. He saw a tiny, barely flowing stream with a swimming hole only a few feet across and not much more than waist deep. The rope swing was tied to a branch that he could jump up and touch. Embarrassed and wondering if he would ever again regain their trust, he turned to the boys to apologize. Before he could begin, they turned together to face him, and as the younger nodded his vigorous assent, the older spoke for them both. "Dad, it's just like you told us it would be." My own father was not as tall as a tree, being a bit short of the 5 feet 10 and a half inches that he always claimed, but he set a challenging standard despite his modest stature. He never talked about it, but others remembered him as a star athlete in high school and college. I didn't understand just how good he was until the second day of my freshman year at West Virginia University, when I found a plaque in the athletic facility with his name on it. After more than 25 years, he still held the school record for the pole vault. But when I called to tell him about seeing it, he laughed and said it wouldn't be up there for much longer. Dad competed when vaulters used a bamboo pole, and just a year after I found the plaque, a guy using a fiberglass pole broke Dad's record on the first try. by a couple of feet. Dad was a respected lawyer when that was a respected profession, before people told lawyer jokes. He took clients as they came, defending accused murderers, shepherding friends through divorce, getting a few of my teenage friends out of teenage difficulties, serving as legal counsel for the county hospital, drawing up the charter for a new bank, and telling Bobby and Jack Kennedy what they would have to do to defeat Hubert Humphrey in the West Virginia presidential primary election. He was of that rare breed, a man without personal ambition, a man in whom others placed absolute trust. As a child and into my teenage years, I didn't see him as special, just a father who always answered the telephone when it rang while we were at dinner. It never failed to elicit a frown and a shake of the head from Mom, but he just laughed and said, who knows, maybe it will be that $1 million client. But around the time I was preparing to depart for college, I came to know him as a man among men during lunches at the hotel dining room, where he and his cohorts gathered at the round table for 8 and made room for me. There was good humor, rough jokes, and occasionally heated disagreements as they modeled the behavior of men who share the respect they have earned. While we were living in Italy, after he retired, Dad came to visit us. As a West Virginian, he had often heard his home state referred to as the little Switzerland of America, and he asked if we could go take a look at the competition. As we drove up through the Italian pre-Alps, he said he could see the resemblance. Then we rounded a curve and saw the true Alps looming. After a bit, he said, yes, West Virginia does look like Switzerland, but with the top cut off. In a photo from that trip, Dad stands on a hotel deck with our sons when they were 7 and 5. Behind them is the Matterhorn, snow-covered and massive, jutting up into the blue-gray Swiss sky. Dad's shoulders are as broad as the Matterhorn is wide, and the mountain's finely honed peak is just a finger's breadth above his head. Was my father as tall as a tree? No, but from the right angle, he was as big as a mountain, and by any measure, a man to be looked up to. It's all about seeing things in proper perspective.
This one is called Homeward Bound. The sign you see when you leave the airport in Jackson, Mississippi says, Mississippi, it feels like coming home. And it did, even though we hadn't lived there in about 35 years and had to use the rental car company's map to get our bearings and make our way into town. It's not only the town where I grew up, but also the place where Phil and I got married and where our 2 sons were born, a town full of memories for both of us. The primary impetus for this particular homecoming, however, was something neither of us had experienced before, a high school reunion. It was my reunion, so it was easier for me than for him. Still, the large crowd made conversation difficult. One friend compared it to 1-minute dating, where you move from person to person, trying to sound interesting, or in the case of classmates who need name tags with large print, just trying not to sound senile. Phil had the best strategy for coping. He formed a spousal support group with 2 main benefits. 1, you don't have to pretend to recognize people, and 2, you don't have to pretend to be glad to see them. For me, it was fun to see how the class as a whole turned out and to go back down memory lane with a few folks, like the classmate who reminded us of some of the music that was playing during our high school years. Unlike the groundbreaking or socially significant tunes of a few years later, we listened to Purple people eaters, wake up little Susie, and how much is that doggy in the window? This friend admitted that he still holds the words to this last one in his brain. And honestly, he said, I need the space back. Nevertheless, the best parts of the reunion were outside the official agenda. I'd almost forgotten how beautiful my hometown is once you get away from the highway traffic. Between reunion events, Phil and I became sightseers, starting with a neighborhood park where I used to play as a child. Now it's a state park that houses a first-rate natural history museum with outdoor nature trails that offer views that are surprisingly breathtaking in a rainforest with honeysuckle sort of way. Less wild, but equally scenic, were several walks we took around my old neighborhood with its magnificent trees, spring flowers blooming as if to welcome us, and modest houses sitting comfortably on the same block with elegant ones. One of those houses is the former home of Pulitzer Prize-winning author Eudora Welty, who left the house to the state when she died in 2001 at the age of 92. Although my mother had been a friend of hers and I'd been in the house both as a child and as a young adult, I wanted to visit it now as a tourist. But the tourist in me lasted only a moment because the house, which is now a National Historic Landmark, has been so carefully restored and maintained that I expected Eudora herself to walk in any minute. I stood in the living room, which, except for the furniture being roped off, looked exactly as it did when Phil and I and our sons visited her in 1985, even with some of the same books lying on the coffee table. The place took me back to that occasion with such intensity that I felt warm all over, almost feverish, in spite of the air conditioning that had been installed to make the house cool for tourists. Although perfectly still on the outside, I was in a blur of time travel, going back to the 80s and then continuing straight to the 50s of my childhood, meeting all my different selves along the way, and somehow emerging whole and revitalized. I can only call it the Welty House Spa effect, and believe that Eudora would have approved. The volunteer docent / tour guide was a charming fellow who had graduated from a rival high school a few years before me, and he recommended that we go see a special collection of Mississippi art at the Art Museum. The next day we did just that. And while we were there, this same fellow walked in the door, proving that Mississippi is a place where you run into people you know, even the ones you just met the day before. He was with a female friend who graduated from my high school just a couple of years after me and who now lives in Houston. Naturally, we played the state game of Mississippi. Do you know so-and-so? And I found out that she lives next door to one of my high school classmates and is a cousin of another, proving that in Mississippi there are only 2 or 3 degrees of separation. Along with outstanding work by Mississippi artists and exemplary paintings and photographs by others whose inspiration was Mississippi, the exhibit featured quotations from well-known writers. The one that struck me so deep that I had to jot it down on the back of my flight itinerary was this one by Eudora. There may come to be new places in our lives that are second spiritual homes, closer to us in some ways, perhaps, than our original homes. But the home tie is the blood tie. And had it meant nothing to us, any other place thereafter would have meant less, and we would carry no compass inside ourselves to find home ever, anywhere at all. We would not even guess what we had missed. It's easy to get around in the rural county where I now live, since it has only one 4-lane road, just one incorporated town, and fewer than 40,000 people. But when we first moved to North Carolina 20 years ago, we lived in Durham and had to keep a compass in the car so we could find our way to downtown and back. The car compass was plenty useful, but now I see that it's the other compass, the one I got in Mississippi, that always gets me home. I think you need this book.
Well, now that Ellen has read a piece about going home, I'm going to read a companion piece, sort of the other side of the story. This one also is inspired by my father, and it's called "You Really Can't Go Home Again." Dad lived the last days of life lying in a nursing home bed. His last wish was simple, but impossible to grant. I want to go home. He gave me no clues, no details about where home was or what it was like, but I was sure that it had nothing to do with the latest in the series of look-alike houses in subdivisions built around Florida golf courses, where he and Mom spent the final quarter of their lives. I think Dad was giving voice to a special sort of homesickness, expressing a deep longing to return to a life in a place of belonging, to recover the comfort that comes only from having the sense of being in the right place, the sense of living grounded. An old witticism defines home as where, when you go there, they have to let you in. It's an idea reflected in the theme song of the television show Cheers. You want to go where everybody knows your name. And the sense of belonging underlies the comment sometimes heard in the rural county where I live. You're not from around here, are you? It's a statement, not a question, and it's not meant as a joke. My unspoken response is, no, and I never can be. So am I at home here? Sort of, because everybody knows my name, but not really, because I'm pretty sure they don't have to let me in. I often experience longing for past moments of belonging as memories of brief triumphs and satisfactions, vignettes that run through my mind like old home movies. These are memories of moments when I was a natural athlete, or saw my way through a mathematics proof, or spoke a phrase in Italian so well that the listeners were fooled into thinking that I was speaking my first language. They elicit the feeling of my being exactly right for a time and place, but I realize they are about me and not about the time or the place, and almost always about the grown-up me. I wonder if childhood is a time of mythic, unquestioned knowing that one is in one's proper place, and if adulthood begins when one first feels wholly out of place. My recollections regarding belonging are selective, and I think that's the way it has to be, in order for me to be able to screen them as the fairy tale that my mind's eye needs to see. I never replay memories of embarrassment or the times of being a clumsy, insensitive jerk. If I make a list of character traits, with hero traits like deft, quick, generous, kind, and subtle down one side, and jerk traits like clumsy, slow, selfish, mean, and blunt down the other, the person playing me in the film of my life's highlights is drawn entirely from the hero side of the ledger. We tend to value that which is rare, and the rare occurrences are what I collect and select for for viewing, scenes that show what I wish the average, everyday me could be. Golf is a good example. I am an absolutely terrible golfer, but I usually manage to hit one good shot out of the 100 or so that I hit each round. And while I cannot recall a single bad shot that I ever hit, I can replay in full color slow motion that time 5 years ago when I nailed a 4-iron off a side hill lie, hitting a fade, not a slice, landing it 2 bounces from the green so that it rolled up pin high. I'm positive that the person who hit that shot is my real inner golfer. And I tell the guy who hits the other 99 shots to just remember how the real golfer did it and do it that way every time. It's just possible that selective memory is essential for the survival and mental health of humanity. I have no personal experience in this area, but I've heard it said that if women could remember the pain of childbirth, the human race would have died out long ago. So given the selectivity of my memory, given that I obviously have a fine mesh filter in place to restrict my collection to only those scenes in which I appear like a Playboy centerfold in living color with blemishes airbrushed away, what use is it to me? What trust can I place in it? Satchel Paige was not a fan of the past, advising us, don't look back. Somebody might be gaining on you. And the Buddha stressed the importance of living in the present moment because attachment and expectation regarding the past and future are the sources of pain and suffering. But I think it was Thomas Wolfe who captured the truth about the past most fully with his title, You Can't Go Home Again, because we really can't. If we think of home as a perfect confluence of the right self, right time, and right place. Change is constant for self and for time and place. And nothing, absolutely nothing, remains of those right times, right places, and right selves that were essential for the creation of the moments that my memory preserves. But despite the one-sidedness of my recollections, I like to think that they serve a useful purpose by giving me a glimpse of my own potential, letting my best self model the person that I could be, giving my flawed self an inner teacher, one who doesn't lecture, but who instead just shows that it's actually possible for me to get life right. A high school tennis coach once told me, your body is capable of hitting every shot to every part of the court, of serving an ace every time. You just have to get your head out of the way. And I see that in the things I choose to remember, athletic or not. There's no thinking about what to do or how to do it. Like the Nike ads say, I just do it naturally. I've spent many minutes pondering Dad's last wish, wondering what images and achievements were captured in I want to go home. And I wonder if I will someday experience that same longing, knowing my life is ending and wanting to be someone I once was in a time and a place that once were. If so, I'm guessing that some of it will be about wanting to go back to Mayberry, but most of it will be about wanting to go back to being Opie.
Now for an entirely different topic and a change of pace. This one is called Sock It To Me. At the first of every year, newspapers and magazines are filled with articles on making and keeping resolutions. The most popular resolution seems to be about weight, reducing it. And the second most popular relates to clutter, also reducing it. In both cases, it's not just getting rid of surplus, but also keeping it down. weight creeps back up just as clutter quietly multiplies while our backs are turned. I don't need to lose weight, but I can't feel too virtuous about it since I have plenty of extra pounds of stuff stacked around the house, sitting on surfaces or stuffed in drawers or closets. You don't get feedback about clutter. At least nothing as direct as your pants getting too tight. So it's easy to overlook the accumulation of stuff. In fact, you get positive reinforcement because every now and then you can look for and find an old magazine that has an article with information you need, and you think to yourself, well, I'm glad I kept this. A neat person would have recycled it long ago. Since I have a few friends whose houses are more cluttered than mine, I happened to not long ago upon something that makes me wonder. I found a sack full of socks in the attic. Why the socks were in the attic is a whole nother story. But suffice it to say that I rather enjoyed going through the bag of socks, making pairs and deciding which ones I would keep and which ones would go to Goodwill. Energized by the found socks, I took on the task of cleaning out my sock drawer and was surprised to see the amazing diversity and staggering quantity of socks. There were dozens of socks, scores of socks, short socks, knee socks, dress socks, casual socks, and hiking socks. Socks for every season and every occasion. Socks with boats, socks with cats, socks with suns and moons. Heavy socks, light socks, stripes and solids and polka dots. I divided them into winter socks, summer socks, and socks for Goodwill, feeling rather well organized until the end of the task when I saw 2 huge piles of socks, so high that a large cat or a small child could be hidden under each one. And for Goodwill, about half a dozen pairs of socks. What? Is it a problem with socks? Or are socks just a sign of a larger problem? In the paper last January, there was a review of a book by an Australian fellow who has written a book about stuff and how having too much stuff is a burden and a handicap. I've always admired our son Ethan, who for years used to fit all his stuff into his Honda Accord with a bike and a kayak on the top. Now he has more stuff and a rented apartment, and I take that as a sign of maturity and stability. Still, I know he could sell the furniture and put all the important stuff back in his car if he needed to. As for me, I have a recurring dream about packing. And whether we're talking about packing a car or a suitcase or a purse, I can never get everything in. I probably need to read that fellow's book. The one bit from the review that sticks with me is his assertion that most people, including me, keep things because of sentimental value that ties them to the past, or practical value that might make them useful in the future. In either case, the stuff works against the present. Can having a lot of stuff really keep us from being fully present? Monks are famous for having very little stuff and for not being attached to what they have. My friend Margie had a philosophy she called Thrifty Rich, and she wrote a lovely little book with that title. She was an expert at thrift store shopping, which she combined with an attitude of gratitude and generosity. In her house in Durham, she had what she called a gift and crafts room, where she kept jewelry she had made or was making, along with bargains of all kinds she'd gotten at various thrift stores. Once she was showing the collection to me and some other friends when I admired a silver dolphin on a chain in a jewelry display. She took it right off the rack and said, "It's yours." In her book, she wisely observed, "We spend much of our early years gathering stuff. Then there comes a time of letting go, a need to balance the flow." Yes, balance is the key. There's another book out there I need to read. This one has an appealing title, A Perfect Mess. And it says people can be a lot more efficient and less harried if they let things pile up and then deal with a lot of clutter at once instead of trying to fight it constantly. Besides, if you strip out everything that's unnecessary, you're left with a bland and sterile environment. The secret, when it comes to dealing with clutter and just about everything else in life, is not the philosophical equivalent of rocket science. It's simply to find a balance between too much and too little. I'm going to start by cleaning out my closet. But first, I really have to do something about all these socks.
That's it for today. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for being here, even though you're not here.
Be well, be safe.